and welcome back to our podcast. I'm the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
So we're continuing our series of some of the most disturbing creepypastas, and this week we're going to be covering Ted the Caver. Now, this one is actually kind of scary in a lot of ways because the claustrophobia,
I can imagine. But I gotta admit, I've never actually heard of this one before. This one's a new one for me.
This is a good one. So this one is also like the one that we read before, written in sort of a journal format. So it starts off on March 23rd of 2001. And it says, due to the overwhelming number of requests I've gotten to tell about my discoveries and bizarre experiences that have happened in the cave not far from my home, I've decided to start this webpage. I will outline the events that happened to me during the last few months, beginning with my journey into a familiar cave in December of 2000 and ending, well, it hasn't actually ended yet. I want to point out a few things before I tell you the events. Most of the photos that I'm going to put up on my website were taken by a Kodak disposable camera. I took a better camera on one or two of the trips towards the end. I will never reveal the names of the other people that were involved in this experience. If you know me well enough, you can probably guess who they are anyway. I will not reveal the location of the cave to anyone for any reason, so please don't ask. I refuse to be held accountable for anyone's life but my own. I will refer to the cave as Mystery Cave. So right off the bat, it's starting strong, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So, if you think these events sound far-fetched, I agree. I would come to the same conclusion if I hadn't experienced it myself. I'll do my best to convey the thoughts and feelings I had during the event, and I will include relevant text, only skipping small parts in the journal, which will occur when an entry has nothing to do with an experience in the cave, like when we're just talking about things like he's having dinner with somebody or something. Doesn't have anything to do with anything, basically. So, the next entry starts in his journal, and it comes from December 30th, 2000. And it starts, B and I decided to get one more caving trip before the new year. So we set our sights on Mystery Cave. Not a spectacular cave, but since neither of us have been caving in a while, it was nice to go to any cave. There was a bit more excitement about this trip, as there was a small passage in the lower portion of the cave that I wanted to check out and see if it was possible to get in it. It has a small opening, and there's always a lot of air blowing out of it. Even though it is way too small to climb through, I've never checked what's inside. We loaded up our gear and hit the road by 3 p.m. We made great time since B liked to drive fast. We anchored from the usual tree that was near the entrance to the cave and began to rappel down into the cave. I went first and started to get my gear together while B came down after me. I will refer to B many times. We've been caving together for many months. He was injured in a caving accident a few years ago and was told he would never walk again. Through hard work and perseverance, he not only walks, but is also able to get around pretty well in caves again. The trickier parts may slow him down a little bit, but he can usually still make it. As for the reference to the small opening in the cave, there is a saying among cavers that says, if it blows, it goes, which means if a passage has a good flow of air, it's probably worth investigating. So, sure. It just doesn't say. I don't know. After we explored the usual passages, we climbed down to check out the hole. The hole is located deep in the cave near the lowest part. It's inside on the cave wall, and it's about 3 feet from the floor. To look inside, I had to kneel down to duck under this overhang of rock. I used the mini flashlight that I had with me and held it inside the hole to see what I could see. I was excited. The wall around the hole was about 3 to 5 inches thick, then it led into a tight passage. The passage opened up a little more inside, and it continued back for about 10 to 12 feet into a small crawl space. But after that, it looked like it actually really opened up. This could be an undiscovered passage since we weren't sure if there was another entrance on the other side. It would take some work to maneuver the tight space, but we thought we could do it. We sat down for a bit to talk about how we would proceed because, they found this tiny little hole. Now, at this point, it's like really small. It's like pinhole size, about the size of a quarter, I guess. So it's small. I mean, well, a little bit bigger than that. It's probably about the size of a softball. It's pretty small, though. Okay, so as we sat in the quiet darkness, we could hear the wind howling from the opening. Then we also began to hear a low rumble from time to time. We didn't think much about it as the cave was somewhat near a highway that was frequented by semi-trucks during this time of day. So we decided our best option was to bring down a cordless drill so that we could drill into the rock, making it easier to chip away. The effort of dragging all the tools down in the cave would be a real pain, but hopefully it would pay off. I named the passage Floyd's Tunnel in tribute to Floyd Collins, who was a caver that had gotten stuck in a too narrow passage back in the early 1900s. Looking back, it's funny how easy I thought our project of widening the hole would be. If I had known how long it was truly going to take, I don't know that I would ever really have started this endeavor.
To be fair, you never really know, one, how thick it's going to be,
Right?
or just how hard
Exactly.
the stone's going to be.
Exactly. You don't know exactly what kind of, unless you're like an expert. And I don't think they're by far not. So we decided to gather our equipment and head back out of the caves for now. Normally, I wouldn't have cared less if I ever came back to the cave again, but finding this new passage really psyched me up and got me excited to return. So the next entry starts on January 27th through the 28th of 2001. B and I were both excited to get back to the cave and start working. I figured it would take around 4 hours to widen the opening enough for us to finally be able to slip inside. Now, I'm just going to tell you right now, he is very, very bad on his time frame. 4 hours is not going to be it. So they brought with them, he says, we brought a DeWalt cordless drill with us, along with some masonry bits and a few other odd and end tools that we ended up not even using. Getting all the tools down to the site proved to be a challenge. One of us would have to lower ourselves down until we found a small ledge we could rest on. Then the next person above would lower the tools down, then lower themselves down, and just basically, go one and the other. Once we reached the cave floor, we then had to drag the tools down the passage that led to the opening. This took us about an hour, and then we were ready to start work. It seems like a lot of effort.
It does.
But whatever. So B went first, with us trading off ever so often to allow the other person a moment to rest. After an hour of back-breaking labor, we quickly realized we were not going to get through this thing in one session. We continued working, trading off to allow the person working to rest or grab something to eat or drink. It was hard work. We really had to push on the drill, and the whole process was painfully slow. After we finally got a hole drilled into the rock, we would then insert a bullpen into the hole and then hit it with a small sledgehammer to break off a piece of the rock. To begin working, we had to get down on our knees, being careful not to hit our heads on the low ceiling. To give you an idea of how slowly it went, the average size of rock that we were able to break off with a hammer was about the size of a fingernail. So
that's pretty bad.
If we managed to break off one that was around palm size, it was time for a celebration. I guess so.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be time for celebration.
Exactly. From time to time, we would try to use a chisel and a 5-pound sledgehammer, hammering the chisel until we were forced to stop and rest. The main issue with this method was that it was really hard to get a good swing on the hammer due to the very tight quarters. We spent many hours working and several trips working on the hole, but we were never able to find a better way to widen it. Another limiting factor was the short battery life on our drill, which each battery only lasted maybe a couple of hours at most. One evening, after working on the hole for several hours, we decided to take stock of our work. You could definitely see some progress. Sadly, it wasn't much overall. After checking our work, we sat down for the first time since entering the cave to rest up for a bit before starting our trek out. As we sat, we could hear the howling coming from the opening, though it seemed louder than normal. We figured that the wind had just picked up outside. However, we were confused as to why the rumbling we heard before also seemed to be louder and more frequent. We couldn't attribute this to trucks, especially since the road was usually dead at this time of night.
So it sounds to me like it's time to get up on out of there.
I'm going to tell you right now, they have a lot of red flags just blatantly thrown in their faces, and they just ignore them. Yet the rumbling continued, seeming to come from deeper within the passage behind the opening. B suggested we ask some veteran cavers their opinion on what would be causing the rumbling noise. We then decided it was time to go. We gathered our gear and made our way out of the cave, leaving behind some of the tools as we planned to return to continue our work. We were both exhausted and decided to crash at a nearby motel so we could head back to the mystery cave the next day. We both ended up sleeping in, which made us get a late start the next day. The day went by about as well as the day before. We worked until both drill batteries had died, and we were still nowhere near getting through. The howling and rumbling also continued as it had the day before. Before I continue, I thought it might be helpful to explain a little about caving and the atmosphere inside a cave. I will summarize our feelings up to this point. So, beer cans can be found intermittently in the cave, mostly in the upper half. When the cave was first discovered, it was probably very beautiful. However, now dust, graffiti, vandals, pigeons, and everything else have diminished it greatly.
As that actually ends up happening quite a
Exactly.
lot,
It
unfortunately.
does. To enter the cave, you will need a good length of rope. In order to rappel down, a nearby tree serves as a good anchor point. The tree is approximately 20 feet from the cave's entrance. Once inside the cave, artificial light will be needed. My preferred choice is a helmet-mounted light, also known as a tag. I also have a mini mag light that's mounted to my helmet that can be detached, as well as another helmet light in my pack as a backup. I also usually bring in a pack or so of glow sticks. While they may not give especially great light, they're a good choice to use when taking a break or eating lunch, so you can save your flashlight's battery. And in a pinch, they could be used to find your way out of a cave if you've literally had no other light source.
Well, at least they're being careful with their light.
Well, yeah, they're bringing back.
They're being prepared.
They're being prepared. They're taking it somewhat seriously. I mean, they are bringing some supplies and things like that. They're not going in just dumbly like a lot of people do. So, as you make your way into the cave, you have to snake your way around sharp rocks as you descend.
Oh, fun.
I know. This, of course, also makes the ascent difficult as well. The walls are lined with sharp white rocks that bunch together in little clumps, and they're referred to as popcorn. So, yeah. I'm telling you right now, this thing is basically just screaming, stay out of me.
It is.
They just keep going. But anyway, my normal clothing choice is usually a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, some gloves, knee pads, and boots. Doesn't offer a lot of protection, but at least I'm comfortable, especially since the temperature inside the cave is pretty constant. Well, we've had it in on some days that were actually really cold, but once we got inside the cave, we found out pretty quickly we didn't even need to have to work. We didn't even need our coats. So at the bottom of the cave, you'll have to do some crawling until you reach on your hands and knees until you reach a roughly 6x6 room. This room is also a good place to stop and take a small rest. Then you will need to get down on your hands and knees again to navigate down a roughly 10-foot long passage that's around 2 to 3 feet high. So yeah, this is just sounding like a lot of
fun. It is. It really is.
I mean, things like this are my nightmare, being trapped in something like this. And something after you kind of thing, that's my thoughts. The floor is covered with a soft dirt that has bits of small pieces of broken rock from above. And at the end of the crawl through this passage, you then have to drop onto your belly and scoot along for a few feet.
Jeez, this just keeps getting better and better.
It does. So once you've squeezed through the tight space, the cave opens enough for you to finally stand up. The cave then splits into 4 passages. 2 routes wind around some rocks and crevices before abruptly ending in dead ends. The other 2 lead to pools of water. All the passages lead in around 100 feet, most of which you can stand up during them and walk. But there are some places that you will have to get down and crawl on your hands and knees again, depending on the path you take. Water is commonly seen within caves, and I had heard that a local had taken scuba gear and dove down into one of the pools within the cave. He claimed that the cave continued on for a couple hundred feet underwater, though nothing else was found, and I don't know, what else.
You could not pay me enough.
Exactly. No, I mean, I also don't even know, if he could have went further, and that was just as far as he could, what I mean, physically could go. But anyway, so I don't really have enough knowledge about rocks to tell you what type of rock we were trying to drill into. Some parts were easier than other parts to drill through, and the rocks were just varying colors. When you come through the area where the cave splits into 4 passages, the ones to your immediate left are the ones that lead to the dead ends. Straight ahead and then to the right are the paths that lead to water. The path to the right is the largest, and it has an arched opening rising about 10 feet. As you make your way down the path, the ceiling lowers to around 6 feet high, and it continues at this height for about another 40 feet. The floor here is also pretty flat and easy to walk along. Now, that wouldn't be so bad, but for roughly the last 20 feet of the path, though, you'll be forced to crawl in on your hands and knees. The floor here also slopes gently downward for the first half of your crawl. Then it gets pretty steep and slippery.
Jesus Christ. No. I say again, you could not pay me enough.
I normally have to help B up this area with a bit of rope because Even an able-bodied person would have to be very careful in this area.
I imagine so.
Exactly. So, anyway, then after another roughly 10 to 12 feet, you'll reach an area where you can finally stand up again. You'll then walk a few feet and climb down a short drop-off. You'll continue on for another about 75 feet before ending in a small pool of water. To the right of the pool, there's a rock wall. On the wall at the rear, that is where the hole is, roughly the size of a softball. To reach this opening, you'll duck underneath the overhang, then crawl along a small ledge that's a few feet from the floor and make your way over to it. As has been my tradition for all the years that I've gone caving, after reaching the deepest part of the cave, all lights are then extinguished. After a bit of waiting, with your eyes straining to find some speck of light, you'll start to relax and your other senses will start to heighten. The sounds and smells around you that were likely overlooked earlier suddenly race to you in perfect detail. Then comes the question that is always at the back of most cavers' minds: what if? What if I had to make my way out of this cave with no light? Would I make it? Would I ever be able to find all the turns and bends which got me here in the first place?
Absolutely not. You will die alone.
And if not, would a rescue team ever be able to get to me in time?
Absolutely not. You will die alone.
The depth of darkness you experience is something that is rarely experienced outside of a cave. This exercise is also a good way to show others the importance of always bringing a backup light.
That's just common sense.
You would think, yeah. We developed a system early on for working on widening the opening. B would normally take the first shift, and after about a half an hour, he'd take a break, and I'd take over for him. We tried different methods from time to time, but mostly stuck to the same thing. We also used safety glasses and dust masks while we worked. From time to time, the drill would hit a softer spot within the rock, and we could progress through our steps more quickly. While one of us worked, the other would try to eat or drink or just lay down and maybe try to catch a nap using the rope bags for padding. The only light we normally used was the helmet light that was on the helmet of the person who was actually working. Since it was usually pointed at the opening, the person taking a break would be pretty much left in almost total darkness. Ah, so peaceful.
Sounds fun.
Yeah. I tried frequently to test the opening to see if it was finally wide enough for me to slip through. However, each attempt was met with disappointment. Though this did not deter me from continuing the work widening the hole. I tried to get out of the cave as much as I could. I tried to get out to the cave as much as I could. I'll admit I was really hoping on finding a new area. Since B was also an avid caver, he was also motivated by the same desire. What we did find was not at all what I expected. So the next entry picks up on February 10th of 2001. We admit we have become obsessed with the idea of finally getting through the opening. It's not really that we think that there's going to be something amazing on the other side. It's more that there's the possibility of being the first human to ever set foot inside it. Although if we did happen upon some hidden treasure, that'd be just fine with us as well.
Well, yes, that is fair.
Yeah, really right.
I wouldn't touch it because I'd be too afraid it's cursed.
So real. Yeah, that's a thought too. When I tell people that I go caving at night, they often ask why, never considering that it's always night inside the cave anyway, so it really doesn't matter. When we returned to the cave and we were making our way inside, B told me that he had talked to some of his caver friends and they had some ideas about what the rumbling noise that we heard was. They thought it could possibly be a waterfall that was located deeper within the cave, though that didn't explain why the noise seemed to come and go. Now that doesn't, because the waterfall would be pretty much constant.
Yeah, it would be.
And unless something was blocking the hole, like wind or something was distorting the sound. I mean, that'd be the only thing I could think of. But anyway, to me, discovering the source of the sound was just another reason to get through the opening. Maybe it's not.
Maybe it's the reason to stop and go back home and continue to live.
Possibly. So on this trip, we brought along Bee's dog. This was fine with me, as we had taken her along on several other trips, and she never was a problem. She would always answer the call of nature before we entered and then wait patiently until we exited before going again. We simply had to lower her via a custom-made harness until she reached the bottom of the main drop. Then she made her way on her own. Her name is Whip, and she loves to explore, but she never ventures out of our sight. Since she has no light attached to her harness, she usually stays pretty close by. We had also planned to try to put her through the opening to see how far she could go. We also knew that if there was any kind of like unseen drop-off that maybe we weren't seeing, she'd turn around and come back and let us know that we couldn't get through at all. Though we still had some more work to do on the hole before it would even be the size a dog could fit through. We made it inside in decent time. We didn't have to bring as much with us as we did on our last trip, as we'd left some of our tools inside last time. I did, however, manage to get 2 more batteries for the drill, so now we had a total of 4. I also brought along some extra drill bits. As I said, we were making good time, even with having to take a bit more time lowering the dog down. Then something really bizarre happened. The dog began to explore, as she normally did, as soon as she was released from the rope. She was in heaven, darting around, sniffing everything. She began running between us from one person to the other, excitement, as we made our way to the worksite. When we reached the area where the cave splits into 4 paths, she started acting oddly, sticking really close to either B or me. As we continued further, she started acting like she was on edge. And we approached the small drop-off that was led to the water hole, and she stopped and would only come closer if we coaxed her. The hair on her back was standing up, and she did not want to leave. We finally got her down, and when we got roughly 20 feet from the hole, she started to whimper and then hid behind B. She had her tail between her legs and was cowering low to the ground. Now, like I said, they get hit with red flags all over the place. This was really weird, as I'd seen her square up with dogs twice her size, but now she was acting like the devil himself was waiting in the darkness.
It might be.
It could be. I figured it was likely some animal that might have used the cave as its home, and she was likely just smelling their scent. But she wouldn't go any further no matter what we tried. We decided that one of us would work while the other would stay with the dog in the area close by where we normally rested. We got back to our normal routine of drilling and hammering with the extra batteries. We were really able to push more out of the drills. It didn't make the work any easier, but it did make it go a little faster. The entire time we worked, Whip did not move. She just lay on a rope bag, shivering and whimpering from time to time. She also never took her eyes off the hole. We really should have been more observant of this intuitive animal.
Yeah, maybe so.
For real. We were on our 4th battery when the second weird thing happened. B was working. He was just finishing drilling a hole and was about to start hammering the bullpen when he stopped and started looking into the hole. I was lying back on the rope bags, not really paying attention, kind of zoning out. I happened to glance over after noticing that I hadn't heard him start hammering yet. And then that's when I saw his face that was illuminated by a small light that he'd placed beside him. He was staring into the hole with a look of puzzlement on his face. He then looked over to me and shook his head. I asked him what was up, and he said he had just heard a strange noise coming from the hole. I figured his ears were likely just ringing from the drill, as he has not brought any earplugs with him on this trip. But he was adamant he had heard something. I didn't really have any explanation to offer, so I just laid back on the bags again, closing my eyes, hoping to take a quick nap, because that's what you do. B sat in silence for several minutes before he finally got back to work, though he would pause every so often to just listen. Now, B is usually pretty grounded, so I do believe he heard something, but I'm not too worried. We'll find out what it is once we're able to get inside.
Jesus Christ.
After that last battery died, we sat for a while talking about our progress and resting up for a moment. I then decided to see if the opening was wide enough for me to stick my head in.
Because of course.
Yeah, that's the very thing you want to place inside some small opening and leave yourself completely vulnerable. Here's my head. But anyway, but there was no way I found that I could stick my head inside pretty easily, but there was no way I could yet get my shoulders through. So as I sat kneeling with my head in the hole, I noticed something else strange. The wind had stopped. It had never once stopped blowing any time we'd been inside the cave. I could even remember distinctly feeling the breeze earlier coming from the hole cooling us down as we'd worked.
A slight bit strange.
Stranger still, the rumbling had also stopped. We hadn't been paying close attention, so neither of us was sure when exactly it had stopped. We talked for a while in the dark of the cave, and we debated what could have happened and what was causing all these weird occurrences. Another reason we were still sitting in the cave was that we were both just completely exhausted. We couldn't come up with any reason for the strange events, and after around a half an hour, we gathered up our gear and made our way back outside. Whip was ecstatic to be leaving. Again, we left behind some tools, and there weren't enough people going that deep into the cave anyway, and we were just too tired to even care at this point. We had made some good progress. The extra batteries had helped out a lot, but we still had a long way to go. In retrospect, I can't believe we were being so casual about everything that had happened on this trip. But we were so focused on getting inside the opening that we seemed to just block out everything else.
Whoa.
That's always something good to hear. At
Yeah.
this point, you're just you're screaming at the screen like, stop going outside or something.
Yeah.
Come on. But anyway. Okay, so March 3rd to 4th of 2001 is the next entry. It took us 3 weeks to get back to the cave again. Our attitudes have changed since we first started working on the hole. In the beginning, it had been a fun adventure, but after the last trip, we approached this time more seriously. Our conversation on the drive was more subdued. We hadn't had time to talk much since our last trip due to our busy schedules. We found ourselves talking about rational explanations for the things that had happened. We also found that neither of us had talked much with anyone else during our time apart, which was odd since we usually would always update our friends and family on our progress on the hole. We left early in the afternoon, hoping to beat the traffic. We arrived at the cave and got rigged up to start our descent. For obvious reasons, B had left Whip home for this trip. And don't worry, guys, the dog never comes back again. The dog's fine.
Well, good.
I'll just throw that out for anybody who was ever worried about that. I'll never read anything where anything like that happens. I just can't. But anyway, so we made decent time except for a minor mishap B had where he had scraped his arm slightly on his descent. Thankfully, it wasn't really that bad, and we even just waited till we got to the hole before he even tended to wound. While B cleaned and bandaged his arm, I started working. We both noted that the wind had returned as well as the intermittent rumbling. I had high hopes that this would finally be the day we'd be able to squeeze inside this small opening. When we started widening the hole, the thickness around it was around 3 inches, but as we began to make progress, it began to increase in thickness. And another thing again, just telling you, stay out of here.
Yep.
As a result, this made our progress slower. It's nice to see the small pile of broken rocks below the hole getting bigger and bigger as we slowly widen the hole. We don't normally talk much while we work due to the level of noise, and I have a little more stamina than B, but he tends to get more done than me due to his increased upper body strength. We celebrate our small victories, like the extremely rare occasion where we managed to chip away a fist-sized piece of rock. We can't help but give ourselves a little cheer. I wonder if maybe there is a hidden entrance on the other side. I fantasize about Spanish explorers stockpiling their treasure inside for safekeeping. B is more realistic and figures it's probably just another cave behind the wall. Well, anyway, this trip I wanted to see if we could speed things up with some larger drill bits. I purchased some good-sized ones at the hardware store for a good-sized price. One was larger in diameter than the rest and proved to actually just slow things down as it caused too much friction for our strength to handle. The other bit was a lot smaller in diameter and it was longer. The longer bit seemed to work well and we relied on it for most of the day. Near the end of the day, the bit broke. I'd been pushing hard on the drill, pushing too hard on the bit when it suddenly snapped. Thankfully, we were able to retrieve it and it was still usable, though missing a few inches in length. Working was going pretty good until about the time we were about to change to our 4th battery. I was kneeling down and working the drill into the wall with a lot less force this time. I had my earplugs in and safety glasses on and was just zoned out in my thoughts. Then suddenly I heard a strange noise over the whining of the drill. It was really loud since I could hear it above the noise of the drill and through the earplugs I had in my ear. So that sounds good, right?
Yes.
You're in a dark cave. So, at first, I thought the noise had been made by the drill or the bit, but it wasn't, because it wasn't uncommon for it to make some weird noise from time to time as it chewed through the rough rock wall. It took me several minutes to realize that the noise was coming from inside the opening. I stopped drilling and yanked out my earplugs just in time to hear the most horrific scream I had ever heard. I stared at the hole, wide-eyed. For several seconds, I didn't move or breathe. I finally turned to look at B, who had just been moments earlier lying on the nearby rope bags, trying to get some rest. But now he was standing at alert, mouth agape, and a look of concern on his face. I turned back to the hole again, almost expecting to see a face staring back at me. However, nothing was there, and nothing appeared any different. I looked toward the back as far as I could see using my light, but there was no movement and only darkness beyond the reach of my light. In the total silence, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. B made his way closer and then stood watching. A few moments later, when he finally broke the silence by speaking, it made me jump. He said to take some rocks and put them in the hole. He explained that whatever animal had made the noise might not be able to get through the hole. I began to hoist them into the opening to create a wall between us and whatever was on the other side. Since the opening was still tight, it didn't take long. Though I'm not convinced the sound came from an animal, I said nothing to B, but that was just my thought. From the time it happened to the time I made it to my journal entry, I have tried to come up with a reason for that noise. To describe it, it sounded like a cross between a man screaming in pain and a cougar screaming in pain. The noise had reverberated through the cave, ringing in my ears. We estimated that it had lasted maybe 8 to 10 seconds, though it's difficult to judge when you're listening to what sounds like a soul anguishing in hell. After I'd managed to plug the opening, we sat in silence. My breathing slowly returned to normal. Finally, B suggested we get back to work, but to keep an eye towards the rear of the passage. It was at that point that we realized the wind and rumbling had again stopped. To say I was nervous would be a gross understatement. Though neither of us said anything to the other, B started the next session of drilling, which was fine with me. I wasn't really tired for a break, but being further from the hole felt good. I sat watching B work, leaving my light on. I wasn't very close to the hole, but I still found myself looking behind my back towards the water hole. Every time my light casted an odd shadow, my heart jumped in my chest. Oddly, B seemed to be much less concerned than me. He seemed to be focused entirely on getting inside the passage. I strained to hear above the drill, but heard nothing unusual. After a while, I found myself getting relaxed again at the prospect of finally getting inside the passage, though I'm not sure if it was due to fatigue or the prospect of maybe finding something valuable. My thoughts were broken when B stopped working. He said the battery was dying and said to set the drill aside and begin working with the bullpen and hammer. After several minutes of hammering, the bullpen was still protruding from the stone. B held the hammer towards me, inviting me to take some swings, but I held my hand up and shook my head. He didn't press the issue. Then, without another word, we gathered our gear and made our way outside. I had to stop and wait for B several times, not due to him moving slowly. I was just really eager to be outside again. My next entry talks about the rest of our evening. We grabbed dinner and decided again to get a motel room so we could head back to the cave early the next day. I cannot believe how willing we were to go back to the cave after hearing that scream. I guess part of the reason was that B seemed so indifferent about it. I still have difficulty understanding our thought process at that time. The next entry is on February 13th of 2001. It's amazing what a good meal and a little sleep can do for someone's attitude. Even though we still had lingering memories of the scream, we had relit our fire of enthusiasm. We were so close to getting inside the passage. Once we reached Floyd's tomb, we were again ready to blaze the trail that would lead to the undiscovered portion of the cave. We immediately noticed that the breeze and rumbling had returned. The bullpen sticking out of the wall was an obvious place to start today's work. B took the first shift, and I took my normal spot nearby on the rope bags, though I was itching to get started. After around 2 to 3 minutes, B let out a cheer. He then turned to reveal a handful of rock. He was breathing heavy, but a smile was plastered on his face. For the first time, the scream had been forgotten, and the vision of our success held our attention. The left corner of the hole had always given us grief. Because of its thickness, we thought if we could just get that corner cleared out some, we might be able to get our way inside. Excitement consumed us as we examined the hole. I then took a hammer and removed the jagged edges of rock that would likely shred my skin. The size looked good. It was finally time for the moment we'd been waiting for. Due to the small size of the hole, I decided that I would enter the hole with one arm stretched over my head, but found that the only way that I was going to fit would require me to stretch both arms above my head in sort of a diving position. I would then have to turn my head to the side. The width of the passage was the limiting factor. The height was not that bad. In order to enter, I stood on my feet and bent over to get level with the entrance. I had to bend my knees, and the position was uncomfortable. It was sort of like a semi-squatting position, bent at the waist with my arms over my head.
Jesus, that does sound uncomfortable.
I also had to turn my torso to the left in a counterclockwise rotation as I negotiated through the opening of the hole.
Jesus, this is just getting worse and worse.
I got my arms through with minor scrapes, then came my head. By keeping it turned to the side, I was able to get in, for the most part, up to my shoulders. When I started working my shoulders in, I could feel the rocks touching all around on my shoulders and chest. It wasn't going to stop me, but it did cause me to get pretty scraped up. I decided to push through. Pain wasn't too bad, and soon I was in. Once I got my upper body inside, I had a few inches all around me to which to position my body a bit. This was the largest part of the passage, and it was conveniently located right at the beginning. Mind you, he is squashed in here like a freaking bug in this little opening. But this is the biggest part of this passage. I could move my head around freely, but everywhere I looked, I could only see a rock wall. When I turned to talk to B, my voice sounded muffled. I could rest my chest on the floor, but bits of rock made it painful. The squeeze near the end of the passage was even tighter. I wasn't sure I could clear it. I wanted to make my way further into the passage, but I needed to clear some of the rock bits from the passage floor. I was quickly disappointed when I found that the bits were attached and from the floor and they would not come loose. I had pushed the sledgehammer into the opening before me, so I used it to drag back and forth across the floor, hoping to smooth it out some. I slid the hammer further into the passage and estimated that the passage shrank down to about 7 inches high. I figured we needed to do a bit more work in order for me to slip through. I was in a really small passage, or at least my upper body was, though I was feeling pretty calm. I decided to try a push. I slid my hammer as far as I could reach. I had to then rotate my hips to the proper angle, which had me leaning my upper body on my forearms. I could then use my feet to push myself in further. After my hips cleared the opening, I began to work myself into a position that would allow me to push through the narrowing gap. There was no room to adjust, so whatever position I was in would have to be the one I used until I got to a wider opening. I decided to try to pull one of my arms back and leave one arm stretched out above my head. Moving forward wasn't too bad. I could use my overhead arm to pull and the arm at my side to push along the wall. Then at the same time, I would try to arch as much as I could to keep my chest off the rocks. I tried both ways, but found turning my head to the right felt the most comfortable. It was made difficult, though, as I needed to look overhead. As I moved, I constantly scraped my chest against the rocks. They were sharp and painful. I finally reached a point I thought I was unlikely to make through. I decided to give it one more push. I rested for a moment, then I exhaled all the air from my lungs, but since it takes so much effort to move forward, I was only able to go a few inches before I had to stop again to take a breath. Then, unbelievably, I did the same maneuver again. I continued on. Rest, exhale, scoot, rest, then repeat. I couldn't believe how relaxed I was, even though I was pinned in such a tight space. I tried a few more times to move forward, but my back was too scraped up to continue. Backing out wasn't too hard, but it did take some effort. The smallest part of the passage was at roughly the 9-foot mark, so we were close. After some rest, we gathered our gear and exited the cave. I remain amazed at how quick we were to disregard all the strange happenings that had been happening at the cave. The next passage is for April the 7th of 2001. Prior to going back to the cave, we spent a lot of time prepping. We made a squeeze box, which was basically a wooden box with an opening that could be adjusted in size. We then could crawl through the opening to get an idea of how tight of an opening we could maneuver through. We determined that we would need around 8 inches of height to get through. We also figured out the best way for me to lay was on my stomach with both arms at my side, which let my shoulder blades drop to their lowest position. I would then use my toes to push myself forward, kind of crawling like a snake on my belly. B came up with the scraper idea that used angled iron. He had his neighbor weld it together for him, and it worked well. I also came up with an idea for some metal pipes that I had my neighbor to work on for me that could be taken apart so that we could get them down there so that we could use that to help lengthen the length of the scraper. I made a vow that I would not leave the cave until I made it through the passage. We were excited to get back to the cave, and our climb down took a little longer as we had some more tools and things to bring along with us. We began working using the scraping tool, using a hammer to hit the end of it, then using it to push the debris as far out of the passage as we could. We worked for about 2 hours, and I was again ready to try the passage. I kept my flashlight in my hand, even though my hand was going to be at my side. I would need it once I got through the passage. Made my way into the opening and began to slowly inch along. Using my toes to push, I crept forward. I was able to clear the tighter spot in the passage, but as I reached the lowest point in the passage, I began to feel the press of the sharp pebbles rolling underneath my chest. I could feel 1,000 sharp edges dig into my skin. I then felt a twinge of excitement when I thought about how our dreams of clearing the passage was so close. That thought got me moving again. I began again. Exhale, scoot, rest, repeat. After a few more inches, I could raise my head off the floor. It was finally opening up. I relayed the info back to B, who was standing near the entrance. I took a few seconds to celebrate, then continued on, grinning from ear to ear. Progress was still slow. I had to scoot along for a couple of feet before I could finally slide my arms underneath me so that I could use them to sort of pull myself along some. Then I was able to, at last, sit up. I was through. I shouted back to B, knowing he would likely never get to see the area firsthand. At this point, I only had my mini mag light, so I couldn't see very far. I began telling B what I was seeing at the end of the passage and that how it made a gentle turn to the right and seemed to go on for a good ways. B then used the poles from the scraper and from when we had rigged up the other poles and used them to push my gear through the passage. I put my helmet on and turned on the light. The only thing I could see was the passage, immediately following the squeeze. I began to make my way down the passage, and B slid the pipe through the tomb with a loosened tip on the end so that I could detach a small section. He said I could use it as a weapon in case I ran into an animal or something. And if I got seriously injured, there was no way anybody would be able to get to me here in time. The passage continued on for around 20 feet. At the end, it bent slightly to the right, and I would have to climb up a gentle slope for the next section of the cave. This section was about 40 feet long, and both sections were fairly straight. I could barely hear B anymore, though, so I yelled back that I would continue on for another half hour and then head back. He yelled back that was fine. I made my way through a few more passages for another about 100 feet or so. Then the cave began to open up a little, and a segment to the left opened up into this small room. I looked around and noticed that there was this large round stone that was sitting near the edge of the wall in the room. It looked different from the other rocks I'd seen around here, as this one was really smooth and almost looked perfect. I continued on out of this room, and I was now in an area that was around 15 feet high and about 30 feet long. At the far end, there was another passage leading out. I went through the opening and stepped into another room, and I suddenly had an eerie feeling, that weird sensation that comes over you that you're being watched. The excitement began to fade as I thought about how truly alone I was. Thankfully, it was about time to head back to B anyway, and I was just about to head out when something caught my eye. On the side of the room, around eye level, there appeared to be what looked like hieroglyphics. It looked like a crude representation of a group of people standing around some kind of weird symbol. I snapped some photos and then headed back to B. I'd also taken several photos of all the areas I could move around in so that B could get a glimpse of the area. When I got back out to B, I could barely talk fast enough as I tried to convey everything that I had seen, and he was just as excited to hear about it. As we debated our next move, I told B that we should bring someone else the next time we came, just in case something happened, and he agreed. Something strange happened with the photos that I took at the new part of the cave. The first ones had turned out fine, and all the ones after, though the photos that I took in the last few rooms didn't turn out at all, rather. The negatives were completely clear. It was very odd. The next entry takes up on April 14th. It only took a couple of days before B found someone who wanted to go with us to the cave. He said he hadn't given anybody any idea where the cave was, so that we would be the first ones to explore it to our satisfaction. The guy we took with us had no idea where we were going, and he had been sworn to secrecy once he had discovered the location. I won't say his real name, but I will just refer to him as Joe. Joe, B, and I set out early so that we would have plenty of time to explore. Joe was impressed by the work that we had done, and also noticed that he was a rather thin man, but he did have a whole lot of cabin experience. He said that this was likely the tightest squeeze he'd ever made, but I wasn't worried. I was physically bigger than him, and I'd made it through just fine. Joe went through first, and then I was to follow. Then, as before, B would pass our gear to us using the metal pole. B gave us 2 hours to return. It was nice of him to sit as our babysitter for us, because I knew it could probably get boring just sitting out there waiting. It was probably irresponsible of us not to tell Joe about the scream we had heard, as well as the other weird happenings. But how exactly you tell somebody something like that? It wasn't like we felt in danger, or we wouldn't be putting ourselves in harm's way, because we wouldn't go down there if we thought there was anything going to happen. We didn't tell him about anything before he entered the cave. We did tell him about it later, but by then it had been too late. Joe made easy work of the passage, slipping through almost effortlessly. Once he cleared the squeeze, we passed him his gear, and then he continued on. I slipped inside and began to make my slow progress. Then I reached the area where B could slip my gear to me. Everything was fine, and then the disaster struck. While I was gathering my gear, I managed to smack my head against the unforgiving stone ceiling. It knocked my helmet from my head and ended up making a pretty big gash out on the back of my head. Not only was I bleeding, but also I suddenly just didn't feel very well. I told B what had happened so that he could send in my first aid kit. I patched myself up and told Joe I didn't think I could continue. He looked like a little kid who had just been told Christmas had been canceled. For selfish reasons, I didn't really want him to go on his own, but I decided he should at least get to see a part of the cave since he'd been willing to make the trip. I told him how far to go and told him it would take him roughly 20 minutes to get there and back. Then I sent him on his way. I rested for a few minutes, then made my way back through the squeeze. It was so disappointing after having come all this way and then not to get to explore more. I sat down and munched on a protein bar and started chatting with B while we waited for Joe to exit the passage. I told B I would pay for the motel room if he'd stay over, then tomorrow we could see how I felt and maybe head back out again. B said he was willing to give it another go. We decided that if Joe was in, that we'd plan on heading back tomorrow. We sat in silence, hearing no sounds coming from the hole. Suddenly, we felt like we shouldn't have let Joe continue on his own. B went to the hole and called for him, but unsurprisingly, there was no answer. We nervously waited to hear anything, good or bad, just any sound coming from the hole. The time limit that I told him of pretty much 20 minutes had passed. Then 25 minutes passed. I really didn't feel like going back inside the hole, but I was definitely going to head in to make sure that Joe was okay. Just as I was prepping to head back in, I saw a light deep in the passage. "Joe?" I called out. No response. I called again. Nothing. The light got brighter, and I could hear someone crawling through the passage. It was Joe. He made it back to the area where he could feed his gear back through. After he emerged from the hole, I asked if he was okay, to which he replied, no. He looked terrible. His face was pale, and he was out of breath. He had numerous cuts and scratches on his face and his arms, and his eyes were wide and wild. Without a word, he began to head towards the exit. B and I gathered up the gear and followed him. A part of me still wanted to go back into the cave, but with the dizziness I was feeling, it wasn't a good idea. I then noticed that B and Joe were making good time, and I was pretty much just standing here alone. Chills ran down my body, and I scurried to catch up. Once we got out of the cave, I figured we'd be able to get some info out of Joe, but he just unclipped his rope and went straight for the truck. B and I gathered up the gear and loaded it into the truck. Joe refused to stay another night at the motel, so we headed on home. We tried to question Joe, but his answers were really vague. He just keeps saying he went in the cave a bit and then he felt sick. The next entry is on April 28th of 2001. The cave for B and I represented the culmination of weeks of hard work. To us, we were not standing on the brink of destruction, but rather honoring the commitment we'd made. 2 weeks after our trip with Joe, and we were headed back to the cave. To prepare, we contacted the local cave rescue group and got permission to use their low-voltage two-way phone. The phone consists of 2 handsets that are connected by a thin spool of wire. This would allow me and B to stay in contact. Right away, it felt like something was telling us not to be there. It took a few times for us to clip our ropes. We would stumble when we were walking or we were dropping stuff. We finally made it to the hole, and after a gear check, I made my way inside. The trip through the tomb went pretty smoothly. We tested the phone, and once I was in and found that it worked great, I also took my camera, or my video camera, so that I could video some of the things I saw. Large objects turned out pretty good, but it was harder to make out some of the detail on the smaller objects due to the poor lighting. I continued on until I reached the large room with a passage at the end, and I soon found another passage that led off into darkness. I ducked under the low-hanging top, prepared to see something new. The walls of this new passage were darker than the rest of the cave up to this point, and the floor was also covered in the same broken rocks, and the ceiling was low enough to require me to stoop down slightly in order to walk down the passage. I could see back about 30 feet where the passage then seemed to veer around to the right. I decided to check in with B, and after a few rings, his voice came over the phone crystal clear. He told me to take as much time as I needed. I thanked him and hung up. I took out the camera and started to film the passage. Then it happened. From directly behind me, I heard a loud scraping sound coming from the large room I had just exited. I wheeled around to face what was making the sound, but while doing so, I also tried to rise fully up, which caused me again to smash my head against the rock ceiling. I heard a loud crunching as my helmet made contact with the hard rock. My light broke and I was plunged into darkness. Pain shot down my neck and down my back. Fear enveloped me and my knees felt weak. The scraping sound had stopped, and the only sound was my rapid breathing, the darkness feeling like it was holding me in place. Finally, I was able to break out of this fear-fueled stupor, and I realized I had my mini mag light still attached to my helmet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I almost wept when I turned the end and nothing happened. I suddenly remembered that I had my phone still with me, and I also had a few glow sticks. I felt around for a glow stick, and I found one, pulled it out, breaking it so it light up, and tossed it down in front of me. The soft green glow, made eerie colors on the cave walls. The stick provided very little light, so I fished out another one and broke it before tossing it further into the large room. I tried to scan the room as the glow stick flew through the air, but I didn't see anything but cave walls. But still, there had been that noise. I used the glow stick near me to light the phone enough so that I could try to call B. I had the phone to my ear, but I was only met with silence. I tried again and again, but the line remained dead. Fear had me on the brink of tears. Something was out there. I could feel it. I don't know how long I waited, but my feet were tingling and my knees were sore. I decided it was time to make my exit. I made my way slowly forward, slowly winding the phone's wire with me as I went. My eyes began to burn, and I realized I hadn't blinked in a while. I continued on, holding the glow stick out in front of me. I approached the area where I usually see that large round rock near the wall. I noticed that the rock had been moved, and now there was a passage behind the rock that was now exposed. The rock definitely wasn't moving by itself. I looked into the new passage, and it went down at a fairly straight path as far as I could see. It was around 3 feet in diameter, and this one, the walls and the floors appeared to be really smooth. It went down at a roughly 45-degree angle. I slowly started backing away from the opening, keeping my eyes on it until I was forced to turn away so that I could continue out. I felt a wave of panic when I was forced to turn my back towards the opening, and I found myself moving much faster than was safe, but I wanted out. I made it to the area where I now needed to kneel down to continue. I lowered down, screaming in pain as my back spasmed, my neck screaming. I knew B was still out of earshot, but I was getting close to yelling distance if I could just make it a little further. I forced myself along, focusing on just moving forward. I finally reached the last area of the cave before the squeeze. I began making my way through, yelling out to B, telling him to get everything ready. I then remembered I'd left my video camera behind. It was just a fleeting thought, but because I really didn't care less about the camera at that moment.
That's fair.
I made my way through the tomb as quickly as possible, and just as I was entering the area where the passage size would finally increase again, the wind in the tunnel increased. It smelled like death. The smell so strong I started to dry heave. B then smelled it too and asked what it was before yelling at me to hurry on. His yelling intensified my panic as I made my way through the last bit. I yelled at him to start his way out and I'd climb up and catch him. He yelled back that he was heading out. I scraped my body all over, but I didn't care. Every scrape was bringing me closer to the exit. I was finally forced to stop and catch my breath as I was approaching complete exhaustion, and my heart rate and breathing were through the roof. During my pause, I heard the scraping noise again from within the cave. In a panic, then, I began to scoot through the narrow passage. I made it to the opening, but when I tried to clear, my shoulders stuck in the hole. I dug my feet in and twisted my body, and finally, when I was able to clear the opening, I plopped down on the floor, 3 feet down, beneath onto the floor beneath the small hole. I rolled onto all fours and then slowly got to my feet. The smell was less intense outside the hole. I began to make my way out, and suddenly I noticed that again the cave was silent. I stood there covered in deep cuts and scrapes, and then that feeling of being alone washed over me again. I turned, scrambling to catch up to B. Every part of me was hurting. My arms were shredded, my shoulder had a nice-sized gash, and I was running on pure adrenaline. I didn't see or hear B until I reached the small ledge just under the drop of the cave. He was climbing as fast as he could, and I could hear his labored breathing. I called out to him, and he told me to get on a rope and start climbing. We both knew this was dangerous. It's normally not something that we would do, but at this point, we both just wanted out more than we wanted to be safe. I decided not to wrap the end of the rope around my arm as I made my way up since my arm was still bleeding. I made it to the ledge and then began to pull up the end of the rope. It was coming along fine, and then suddenly it hit a snag and stopped. I pulled, but it was solid and it wasn't coming free.
Cut it. That's it. Just cut it. Cut your losses
and go.
There was
no way I was going back into that cave, and I didn't have a pocket knife. So I decided to get the rope just as I was securing my harness so I could continue. I heard a weird sound at my feet. I looked down and my pulse quickened because something was pulling the rope back down into the cave. I gave up on the harness and just began clawing my way up the rope, only further injuring myself on the way up as I bounced against the rocky walls. I screamed at B that something was pulling the rope back down, and he yelled at me to hurry up. Luck was with me, and thankfully I didn't lose my grip, because if I had fallen, the fall alone would have likely killed me. I could feel the rope tightening below me. I finally made it out, collapsing in exhaustion. After a few seconds, I made my way over to B, who was leaning against a tree and staring in fear at the rope anchored to the tree. He then quickly pulled out a pocket knife and began to saw at the rope. It took what felt like an hour had passed, but he finally was able to cut it free. We watched it slide along towards the cave entrance, and we hurried to load the truck and quickly left. It's been 4 days now since our last trip to the cave. It's taken me that long to get everything entered in my journal. Every time I started, I would be overcome with memories. The next entry is May 19th, 2001. I wanted to update everyone on my plans for the cave. A lot has happened in the last few weeks. Right now, I'm on medical leave at work. I've been to the doctor, but I couldn't tell him everything about what had happened. Things continued on normally for the most part. Then things started to get strange. At first, I was hearing weird noises around the house. Feelings of anxiety and foreboding filled my mind. Then came the hallucinations. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye. When I started seeing things more and more frequently, I bought a gun. I began to see shapes and shadows. Normally they would peer outside my windows at night. I stopped doing much of anything other than eating and sleeping because I couldn't concentrate and was always exhausted. I then began to have extremely lucid nightmares. Sometimes I'd be in my house and something was trying to get me, only I couldn't run away because I wouldn't have any legs. Other times I'm in a vat and someone is pouring a thick substance over me, slowly filling the vat. I begin to stay awake until pure exhaustion forces me to sleep. I finally reached a breaking point. I didn't know why exactly, but I had to go back to the cave. I hadn't talked to Joe since the incident, so I thought I'd give him a call. Our conversation was extremely brief. "You been back?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "We need to return," he continued. "Tomorrow good?" I asked. "Yeah, noon." I then drove over to B's house and was surprised to see that he looked like he was doing pretty fine, even somewhat happy. One look at me, though, and his disposition changed. I told him about my plans with Joe, and he just nodded his head. I asked if I could stay the night, and he let me inside the house. I quickly noticed that all the lights were on in his house. He showed me to my room, and I prepared to get some rest. I woke early the next day and headed home to get my gear together. I suspect by the time most of you read this, I'll be back home with a great story to share. For the first time ever, I'm carrying a gun to the cave. I'm also bringing a knife and an extensive first aid kit, as well as plenty of food and water and a new camera. I'm taking several sources of light and also a pad and a pencil. There's so many questions I need answered. Was it all just a side effect that was made from a blow to my head, as well as the injury to my back and neck? The knowledge that I'll have someone with me in the passage does nothing to alleviate my fears. I also wondered if my video camera can continue capturing footage, because I'd left the thing running in my panic when I dropped it. Most of you don't agree with my decision to continue to explore the cave.
Nor do I.
I'm afraid I don't have a choice. If I ever want any peace, I have to go back. See all of you soon with lots of answers. Love, Ted. There are no further updates that were ever made to the webpage, and the whereabouts of B, Joe, and Ted are still unknown.
Well, they're dead. Never go caving, people.
Yeah.
You'll awaken some supernatural force and you're just gonna die.
Pretty much, I guess. And yeah, there's even been movies and all kinds. There's a movie about it. It's cool. It's just a cool story. It's very creepy because, like I said, it's the thought of being in this little tight space. That's creepy enough. But then knowing something's chasing you and you can't move, yeah.
God,
It's
I used to
scary.
have a recurring nightmare about that exact feeling.
But right. And it's scary. It is. That's, like I said, I don't like tight spaces to the point I can't move. Like, if I can't move my arm, no. And then I also don't like the idea of being trapped somewhere where I couldn't get out, or away from something that was at all. Like, I wouldn't even have a shot. But anyway, we hoped you enjoyed that new episode. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to stay disturbed.